25 people have been killed. This in the Afghan capital.
As journalists rushed to the scene, a second bomber detonated his device.
Worst death toll for media workers in the country.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. 10 journalists killed in a single day in Afghanistan as the security situation there deteriorates. Malaysia was the first country in the world to pass an anti-fake news law, and now we're starting to see the ramifications. Winnie Madikizela-Mandela was laid to rest in South Africa on April 14th. Journalists have been divided over her legacy. And in Israel, a new video game where the enemy is an anti-occupation activist armed with a video camera. The Afghan journalists rushing to the site of an explosion this past week in Kabul were trying to cover the news. They didn't realize it was a setup. In the aftermath, a second suicide bomber disguised as a news cameraman detonated his device. The attacks claimed by the Islamic State left 29 people dead, including 9 journalists. Another Afghan reporter was shot dead that same day, and the carnage serves as a brutal reminder of the perils of being in the news business in Afghanistan. Phenomenal growth in the media there is considered one of the tangible positive legacies of the 2001 coalition invasion. However, 4 years after the drawdown of foreign troops, a worsening overall security environment has put journalists under all kinds of new pressures. Already targeted by militant groups like the Taliban and the Islamic State, news outlets are also getting heat from the government side. Parliamentary elections are coming up this year, and some state officials are clearly out to muzzle the news media. Our starting point this week is the site of the bombings, Kabul.
It was the bloodiest attack on journalists in the history of Afghanistan, and we lost some of the best journalists Afghanistan had.
Our cameraman, Yar Mohammad Tohi, Shamarai Faizi, AFP photojournalist, Kakar from Radio Free Europe, Salim from Mashal TV, most of them were young generation.
It was one of the deadliest incidents for Afghanistan media and for Afghanistan journalists, because this one was directly targeting reporters.
The first explosion took place at 8 a.m. The journalists who rushed to the scene would not have had time to notice that one of the cameramen there was an imposter. They would have assumed he was one of them. 15 minutes later, his hollowed-out camera, crammed with explosives, was detonated. The subsequent news feeds contained far more images from the aftermath of the first bombing than the second, because after the second explosion, there were fewer journalists alive to take them. Sometimes it's the relative lack of pictures that tell the story.
In the scene there were some other groups of people around, civilians, security forces, but based on the reports we have, the one who was carrying a bomb, it was installed within a camera and it exploded just right among the journalists and reporters, and that led to a big loss for Afghanistan media family. This is something that we'll not forget, we'll not forgive either.
None of my colleagues or journalists from other media outlets expected the second attack, because he was disguised as a journalist and he was trying to make everybody feel like he's one of them. Journalists might be very careful after this. Now the fear has spread, and probably they would be very, very reluctant sending out the journalists to the bomb blast site. This is going to affect the whole media situation in Afghanistan.
To honor the victims and protest the treacherous conditions that Afghan journalists face, one paper, Hashtag Sob, published a blackened front page. The editors did the very same thing 2 years ago, when Taliban fighters attacked a van load of journalists from the country's biggest television channel, TOLO TV, killing 7 of them. Although responsibility for this week's twin explosions was claimed by the Islamic State, the Taliban represents a much wider threat to journalists. The group now controls or contests more territory roughly 40% of the country, than at any time since the invasion of 2001. And wherever the Taliban is making a comeback, journalists have reason to fear or watch their words.
Militant groups don't want their atrocities to be covered and reported. And it's basically the media who highlights, who reveals atrocities that they commit.
نظامیان کشور طالبان را متهم می‌سازند که با گرفتن اداره خوابگاه دختران دانشگاه کندوز شمار از دختران این خوابگاه تجاوز کردند.
The attack of terrorist groups against media are mainly because of these reasons. The Taliban attacked a van carrying employees of TOLO TV in January 2016. In that incident, 7 of the employees of that TV station were killed, and it resulted in a huge wave of self-censorship all across Afghanistan. The objective of the Taliban to create black holes, to create information black holes.
Taliban are attacking not only journalists, but the telecommunication towers and other structures that are related to media and communication. They are trying to destroy the very fabric of the media and communication, so people don't have first-hand and correct information. And this has, of course, created a kind of fear in the hearts of the journalists.
The Taliban's conflict with journalists and journalism goes way back. The group ruled most of Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001. It banned television altogether, declaring it blasphemous, and strictly controlled other forms of media. The US-led invasion of 2001 deposed the Taliban, but at a heavy price. As many as 170,000 civilians have been killed in the fighting since, and successive governments, although democratically elected, have proven to be corrupt. However, the growth of the media sector, much of it fueled by Western money pumped into the country, has been deemed a success. Afghans now have more than a dozen television channels and more than 100 radio stations to inform them, and the freedom the Afghan media have compares favorably to many of their neighbors. Now, one of the few allegedly successful legacies of the US-led coalition invasion of vibrant media space is at risk.
The growing pressure on journalists in recent years has created self-censorship. That's number one. Number two, it's going to weaken the capability of media outlets to cover stories, particularly stories of atrocities. Number three, it's gonna encourage a lot of journalists to leave the profession. So the long-term effect of this will be that we will lose much of the press freedom that we have in Afghanistan today, which is the most vibrant press freedom in the region.
The Afghan media are also coming under increasing pressure from the body that's supposed to offer them protection, the government. The Afghan Journalists' Safety Committee says that over the last half of 2017, government workers, politicians, and police were responsible for almost 1/3 of incidents involving either violence against or intimidation of media workers. Journalists who produce stories about corruption often become targets of state officials.
We have faced with many challenges with both sides, with militants and inside with government. The militants, they are targeting us directly, but the government officials, they try to censor, they try to limit our access to information. They're happy for free press in Afghanistan until we focus on their weaknesses and we focus on their corruptions.
Because we name and shame some of them who are engaged in corruption. And whenever you report on something, they try to blackmail you and accuse you for doing something against the national interest of the country. But we have a law and regulation which is supporting us. We have a system here. We have a media complaint commission. But when it comes to threats from Taliban, there is no institutions to go there and resolve the case. So once they threat you or send you a message, so you have to be careful, because now it seems that they're serious. Once they send a message, they will continue to kill.
As the head of news at TOLO TV put it, the Taliban choose their targets carefully, but the Islamic State targets everyone. Like one of TOLO's cameramen, Yar Mohammed Tohi, who perished in the second explosion, having been lured there by the first. His equipment bears the stains, and his colleagues bear the scars after the mother of all attacks against journalism in Afghanistan.
We're discussing other media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, Meenakshi Ravi. Meena, a few months back, Malaysia became the first country in the world to pass an anti-fake news law, and this past week we've seen it put to use. Tell us about the cases.
There are two legal cases, Richard. The big one involves Mahathir Mohamad, the former prime minister and current leader of the opposition, who's being investigated for spreading fake news after he alleged that a plane he was going to take to file his candidacy documents for the upcoming general elections was sabotaged by government operatives. Critics of this anti-fake news law had warned Malaysians that it could be used to stifle dissent during the election campaign, and the Mohamad case may end up proving them right.
And what about the second case, in which the person charged isn't even a Malaysian citizen?
His name is Salah Salem Saleh Suleiman. He's a Danish national who was in Kuala Lumpur on a visit. He posted a video on YouTube accusing Malaysian police of reacting too slowly to the shooting of a Palestinian lecturer there on April the 21st. The police refuted that, saying they were on the scene 8 minutes after the shooting. They accused Suleiman of publishing fake news with ill intent. He was sentenced to a week in jail and fined the equivalent of $2,500 US. He may have actually got off lightly. The maximum fine under the law is nearly $130,000, and the jail terms can be up to 6 years. But his case does reveal how broad the scope of this anti-fake news law is. That it's not just journalists and bloggers who can be charged, but even non-media people.
A couple of weeks back, we looked at the banning of the messaging app Telegram in Russia. Now something similar has occurred in Iran. Same story, basically, different country?
Well, both stories involve the security forces. In Russia, the intelligence service, the FSB, demanded access to the code that would get around Telegram's message encryption. When Telegram refused, a court ordered the app to be shut down. In Iran, Telegram's license to operate has been cancelled after security forces said it needed to be banned in order to, quote, confront illegal activities. All of this comes after countrywide protests at the end of last year, when a few Telegram accounts were shut down and the app was blocked for a couple of weeks for allegedly inciting violence.
And now a new replacement messaging app developed in Iran, championed by the government, has come onto the market. Tell us about Soroush.
Soroush comes with the endorsement of the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, who deleted his Telegram account last month, switched to Soroush, and has encouraged Iranians to join him. The app doesn't offer anywhere near the same levels of privacy and encryption that Telegram did, and there's been a lot of attention globally to the fact that users can download stickers or emojis of protesters with placards reading "Death to America" and "Death to Freemasons." The app has 5 million users so far. Telegram had nearly 50 million Iranians signed up. A joke that's gone viral says that compared to Telegram's 2 ticks that notify you when a message has been read, Soroush's 3 ticks are to confirm that even the intelligence services have been through your messages.
Okay, thanks, Meena. Last month, South Africans laid to rest one of their iconic anti-apartheid leaders, Winnie Madikizela-Mandela. For all those years that her husband, Nelson Mandela, was imprisoned, Mama Winnie, as she was known, moved to the front line in the fight against white minority rule, earning the respect of her people and the ire of the apartheid-era government. Which is why, in the days after her death, many South Africans took exception to the way her obituaries read. How she had been reduced to the former wife of a president who played a bit part in the struggle, or was caricatured as an angry, vengeful woman who had lost her way. Then, just days before her funeral, a documentary aired in the country that showed how the apartheid government, with the help of the white-owned news media, had smeared Madikizela-Mandela with deceptions and lies that made it into those obits. That documentary changed things. The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now on Winnie Madikizela-Mandela, her life, death, and partial rehabilitation in the media.
Ex-wife of the late President Nelson Mandela, Winnie Madikizela-Mandela.
She was a powerful yet controversial figure.
When news broke of Winnie Madikizela-Mandela's death and the obits started coming out, it soon became clear that some news outlets hadn't done their homework.
From the mother of the nation to a tarnished reputation.
Beautiful, brave,
but also brutal.
Madikizela-Mandela, unlike her husband, became the evil that she condemned.
Because the role of the person many considered a titan of the anti-apartheid struggle was being diminished.
The obits were flat. They just didn't have the kind of work that should have been done for this individual. I mean, you had one editor refer to her as damaged goods.
In international media reports, you had Reuters referring to her as the mother then mugger of the nation. And the New York Times said that her legacy in apartheid as a liberator was overshadowed by scandal. You had the BBC referring her as Mandela's wife. That was all that she was diminished to, just his wife.
And you have this backlash, this groundswell from the public, which says that is not the only Winnie Mandela who existed. And so you see this remarkable shift in the narrative, especially local media, covering her now in a much more respectful way.
To understand why so many South Africans objected to the portrayal of Madikizela-Mandela in the days after her death, it helps to look at her life. In 1964, she and her two young children watched as her husband, Nelson Mandela, was sentenced to life in prison. The apartheid government outlawed the African National Congress, the ANC, and prohibited journalists from covering the party in any way that supposedly advanced its so-called terrorist agenda. The struggle for liberation that had been gaining momentum was dealt a severe blow.
In the midst of this, there was one person, Winnie Mandela, who seemed to live without fear, who spoke out, who spoke on behalf of the banned organization, who spoke on behalf of her husband, and was a very powerful image and figure. So she kept that voice alive.
But she also develops quite an important relationship with people in the grassroots. And so in some ways, if an international or domestic media is interested in understanding the feeling of the people, they do so through the lens of a Winnie Mandela.
As such a visible leader of the resistance, Madikizela-Mandela needed to be silenced. For 2 decades, the apartheid government harassed her, shuttled her in and out of prison, held her in solitary confinement, reportedly tortured and demeaned her, and eventually, in 1977, banished her to a remote part of the country. 8 years later, Winnie Madikizela-Mandela defied the government and returned to the media spotlight. This time, the world saw a different side to her. With ratcheted-up rhetoric, a new militancy.
With our necklaces, we shall liberate this country.
Many saw that as an endorsement of necklacing, a brutal form of execution predominantly in black communities, where suspected police informants had tires filled with petrol placed around their necks that were then set alight. The apartheid government and its media apparatus looked at the new Madikizela-Mandela and her personal bodyguards and enforcers who operated under the name of the Mandela United Football Club and saw an opportunity.
The government, who pretended like it was, conducting this war by parliamentary rules, when in fact it was conducting a dirty war, and Winnie Mandela's attitude was, we should respond, fire with fire. The ANC actually said by the late 1980s, make the country ungovernable. People would burn things, would protest. And so Winnie Mandela became sort of the personification of that kind of politics. And so there were excesses. The government could exploit those excesses.
I was co-editor of the Weekly Mail, and this story started to emerge. In particular, we had 1 or 2 young reporters who came and said, there's an issue, there's a problem, there's increasing complaints about the behavior of this football club. The question for us was how to cover it, because the security police and the apartheid state would be eager to use any information and controversy to damage the liberation movement.
By the late 1980s, it emerged that the apartheid government had created a covert unit called Stratcom that specialized in spreading misinformation and propaganda against opponents of the state. As many as 40 journalists were involved from multiple news organizations, and among the anti-apartheid leaders they targeted, Winnie Madikizela-Mandela. In 1989, Stratcom got a story it could work with. A young boy named Stompie Sepe was accused of being a police informant. He was kidnapped, tortured, and then murdered by members of the Mandela United Football Club. When arrested, they said that the order had come from Madikizela-Mandela And while she was never convicted of any involvement in the murder, only in the kidnapping of Sepay, the story was explosive enough for Stratcom, through its media network, to start turning black South Africans against her.
It becomes the single story about Winnie Mandela. And so here is where I think the media, both domestically and internationally, errs. It begins to see Winnie Mandela only as a caricature and only as the woman who had something to do with the Stompie Sepay matter. In fact, she was convicted of kidnapping him. And her reasons for that kidnap were that she was taking him to a place of safety.
A lot of people started to turn against her. There were graffitis on walls saying, Winnie must hang and give us Nelson Mandela back, take Winnie to Robben Island. And so that was the effect of that coverage on Winnie Madikizela-Mandela. She was completely denied by her own people.
I think she, for all intents and purposes, disappears and becomes something of a bit of a pariah in post-apartheid South Africa. She doesn't live on TV, in the papers, in books, in documentaries. She doesn't live in that way.
That was until 3 days before Madikizela-Mandela's funeral. A documentary called Winnie aired on a domestic TV channel. It showed through interviews with former Stratcom agents how Madikizela-Mandela had been targeted in the media.
I already had about 40 journalists working directly or indirectly for me. So through them, I could have specific reports placed in newspapers and it would be front page.
Even back then, she tried to warn South Africans about the coverage of the Stompie Sepay story.
The deliberate and mischievous lies that keep being perpetrated by the media is beyond anything we have seen.
And then the kicker, that Jerry Richardson, the member of the Mandela United Football Club who had killed Stompie and then pointed the finger at Winnie, was in fact a police informant himself. There have been questions over the veracity of some of the claims made in the film, but for many South Africans, the documentary reiterated why they were so angry with some of the initial coverage of Madikizela-Mandela's death, because it read like apartheid-era propaganda.
The documentary, it was a piece, I think, of necessary revisionism, historical revisionism. But I think because when Winnie Mandela died, and all the grievances that people have about the way we talk about women and political struggle, or women and violence, kind of came back.
I think the tragedy is, and it's really been accentuated in this period of mourning since her death, that we have two competing caricatures of her. We seem unable to move beyond either Winnie as the extraordinary hero or Winnie the Witch. And the truth is, they are both crude caricatures. And she's a complicated human being that, like all of us, comes with baggage from the ugly racist past.
Finally, there was a video game back in the 90s that you may remember called Snake. This past week, a right-wing political organization in Israel called Im Turtzu released an Israeli retro version of the game. But rather than having a snake navigating its way through a grid, it has an Israeli soldier named Yotam trying to find his way home. Among the obstacles in his way, anti-occupation activists armed with video cameras. They're from NGOs like B'Tselem and Checkpoint Watch. And just to avoid any confusion on the part of Israeli gamers, the activists are the enemy. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
מהאנשים שהביאו לכם את סוגר שטחים. השתלטולים. בסנייק. מגיע משחק השנה בגרסת רטרו הישראלית. השתולים באים. עזרו ליותם להגיע הביתה בשלום. פשיסט! סתלק מכאן! בקרוב שלב בונוס בגץ. שחקו אונליין עם החברים. עכשיו וב8 ביט. השתולים משחקים בזה כבר שנים.
את גאה במה שאת עושה, חיילת בצד טרור?
רוצים לחוות מה מרגישים חיילי צה"ל שנרדפים על ידי ארגוני הקרן החדשה?
לפני הפיגוע היה עימות בין הלוחם שנהרג לבין פעילת מחסום וואץ' שקרא לעברו אתה בושה.
אתה בושה! פשיסט! אללה אכבר! עכשיו גם אתם יכולים.
תתבייש!
הכובש! חורה חורה פלסטין! למה אתם מחכים? אתה בושה! הצטרפו לקרב בשתולים. חורה חורה פלסטין! היכנסו לקישור והתחילו לשחק מיד.